Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 101, Antigonid-Macedon, A House Divided. Flamininus' defeat of Philip V near the hills of Cynoscephalae in 197 halted the imperial ambitions of one of the most warlike rulers of his generation. The near-catastrophic loss of manpower suffered in the battle ended any possibility of contending with the seemingly limitless resources of the Roman Republic. In support of his Hellenic allies, the victorious consul declared that all Greeks were to be free to live under their own laws, reducing the borders of the Macedonian kingdom to the historical limits of the Argeads. Philip was utterly humiliated, but Flamininus and the Senate allowed him to retain his throne, much to the chagrin of the Greeks, who sought the destruction of their former oppressor. Though his wings were clipped, Philip would continue to rule for nearly 18 more years. Restoring Macedonia's fortunes without incurring the ire of the Senate in Rome was a top priority, as was making sure that his two sons, Demetrius and Perseus, were adequately prepared to uphold their dynasty's glorious legacy, and to continue the Antigonid tradition of familial loyalty. Following the end of the Second Macedonian War, Philip was left with a severely weakened kingdom. Any Greek city not within the traditional borders of Macedonia was freed on the orders of Rome, who made it very loud and clear in their proclamation at the Isthmian Games in 196. This meant that any gains he made in between the first and second conflicts with Rome were handed over, along with territories in Illyria. As the chief aggressor in the war, a large indemnity of 1,000 talents was placed upon the king, with half paid immediately and the other half paid in annual installments for the next 10 years. This sum was paltry compared to that meted out to the Seleucid Empire after Magnesia, but with the kingdom's size substantially reduced and still having to deal with his own incurred costs, it was a heavy financial burden to bear. On top of sending payments to Rome, Philip was compelled to hand over one of his personal treasures, his youngest son Demetrius, as a hostage along with the children of other Macedonian nobles. Militarily speaking, the situation was grim. The bones of 10,000 dead Macedonian soldiers littered the battlefield at Cynoscephalae, and several thousand had been killed or captured in the campaigns outside of it, meaning that the available manpower was severely limited. As a cherry on top, the navy was virtually disbanded barring a few light vessels. This weakness was also taken advantage of by his neighbors. The Dardanians had invaded Macedonia upon hearing of the defeat, forcing Philip to race back with an emergency levy and drive them off in late 197. Macedonia's humiliation was broadcasted widely, and a 3-day triumph was celebrated by Flamininus in 194, displaying the booty captured during the war. The sting of defeat was certainly unpleasant, but Flamininus and the Republic had been merciful in their own particular way. Philip was allowed to retain his crown and kingdom, and no Roman troops were garrisoned in his cities. They had stood up against their Greek allies who eagerly wanted his destruction, and his independence was stressed by the Senate, proclaiming amicitia, an informal friendship. By 194, the Romans returned to Italy. All in all, Philip was left a free agent managing his own affairs. Yet only a few years would pass before a flurry of activity would descend upon Greece once again. Since 196, the Senate had been in talks with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, who had emerged the victor of the Fifth Syrian War against the Ptolemies. Antiochus had been probing into Europe with campaigns against the Thracians, something that disturbed the Romans who had just spent all that time and effort settling the affairs of the region. A proverbial Cold War was in effect, which eventually turned hot in September of 192, when Antiochus crossed into Euboea with an invasion force of 10,500 men. The Senate was deeply alarmed by the arrival of the most powerful man in Asia, no doubt concerned regarding Philip's intentions. Years earlier, he formed a pact with Antiochus to divide the territories of the gravely weakened Ptolemaic kingdom, and with wounds still so fresh, it would not be inconceivable to believe that he might very well use the chance to reclaim his position in Greece. In 193, a delegation was sent to Pella by the Aetolians, longtime opponents of Macedonian interests and the key instigators of the war between Rome and Antiochus. this time urging the king to join in the fight against the Italian barbarians. Roman ambassadors tried to sway him in the other direction, and dangled a very tempting prize: the early release of his indemnity, and the return of the Prince Demetrius back into his custody. The straw that broke the camel's back came in 191, when the Seleucid conqueror decided to bury the bones of the fallen Macedonian troops at Cynoscephalae. Such a responsibility fell on the king of Macedon, and even though it is never explained why Philip had not done so already, it was a direct challenge to his authority, and so Philip decided to throw his lot in with Rome. He sent word to the consul Baebius warning of Antiochus's impending attack on Thessaly, and offered troops and an early indemnity payment to the Senate as a gesture of his goodwill, which was appreciated but politely refused. Philip's contribution to the war effort was actually quite valuable. His assistance in pushing back Seleucid forces in Thessaly allowed him to campaign against the Aetolians and seize the territory of the Athemenian king Amynander, after he demonstrated clemency towards their captured troops. To encourage his enthusiasm, Roman leadership agreed that Philip would be able to keep possession over any city he took from the Seleucid cause, a notable departure from the propaganda slung by Flamininus proclaiming the freedom of the Greeks. He was not present at the engagement at Thermopylae on account of an illness, but was busy overseeing the siege of an Aetolian garrison at Lamia, where a sort of rivalry developed. The consul Glabrio had been besieging the nearby Heraclea, another key Aetolian garrison located only a few miles away from Lamia, and the two leaders raced to capture their respective settlements first. Glabrio managed to win his prize, and so Philip was compelled to hand over the baton so the Romans could claim the glory of victory over Lamia. Antiochus had by this point retreated to Asia, but the war against the Aetolians and the other Seleucid allies in Greece continued. In the winter of 191-190, Philip sent an embassy to Rome with a gift of a golden crown to be dedicated on behalf of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. In return for this goodwill and his contributions in the war, the Senate released Demetrius back into the king's custody, reaffirming their position to remit the last payments of the indemnity if he stayed loyal. This came at a critical time, since an invasion of Asia led by the Scipio brothers was planned for the upcoming year. Even though the allied states in Pergamon and Rhodes were chipping away at Seleucid sea power, the Romans needed to march their armies overland through Thrace in order to get across the Hellespont. This was not going to be an easy task given the high likelihood of raids from opportunistic Thracians, but Philip agreed to provide aid where he could. As Macedonian engineers rebuilt the bridges and roads, the Scipios and their army were furnished with supplies, then escorted with a guard to deter Thracian attacks. This took place during the late summer or early autumn of 190, and a few months later a combined Romano-Pergamene army would confront and destroy the forces of Antiochus III at Magnesia, who then submitted for terms. As the Scipios brought the war in Asia to a close, Philip returned to handle the campaigns against the Aetolians, for if anything, he could seek to directly profit from their defeat and expected further rewards from the Romans, but it was not to be. After the failure of the Senate to negotiate a peace with the Aetolian representatives in November of 190, King Amynander led a counterattack against the Macedonian garrisons in his cities using Aetolian troops. Philip raced out to handle this crisis as soon as he heard the news, but was nearly caught and killed in an ambush before retreating with his men. In turn, the Aetolians were emboldened and pushed into Thessaly to seize more of the king's captured territory. But the victory of the Romans at Magnesia was now widely known, and much of the Aetolian forces were holed up in the city of Ambracia, under siege by the new consul Fulvius. With Amynander's assistance, the Aetolians agreed to surrender entirely to Roman authority, effectively neutered after a century of being an active player in the affairs of Greece. Despite everything he had done in the war, Philip was not invited to the peace discussions with either the Aetolians or in the reorganization of Greece and Asia. Any indemnity was to be paid to the Republic. The allies were merely to get their prisoners of war returned back to them. It wasn't a great deal, but the king hoped to acquire new territory or at least have some restored to him. He did manage to recover Demetrius, one of the fetters of Greece, but attempts by Antigonid representatives in Rome to stress the king's claims on cities in Athymania and Dolopoeia fell on deaf ears as they were given back to Amynander and others. The cities originally taken in Thessaly by Philip and recaptured by the Aetolians were merely freed, not handed over to the Antigonids, which was a snub at best and a betrayal of the terms of their alliance at worst. No aid was given to the king when he faced a counterattack on his captured territories, but they did give an audience to Amynander, who tried to excuse himself by directly accusing the Antigonid ruler of being the cause of his ill-conceived alliance with Aetolia. This was not the first time that Philip would have felt like the wrong party since the outbreak of the Antiochene War, since Glabrio's treatment of him during the siege of Lamia was certainly heavy-handed. Polybius alleges that shortly after being dismissed from his post, Philip invited a captured Aetolian politician named Nicander to his dinner table. In private conversation, the king urged him to convince his countrymen to abandon their fight and join an alliance with Macedonia, implying a mutual partnership against the Romans. He nevertheless continued to provide his support, but it certainly seems to have become disinterested after the war's end. The consul of 187, Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, led an illegal yet highly profitable expedition against the Galatians that captured quite a bit of plunder, but the return trip through Thrace was a complete disaster. Attacks from Thracian tribes and attrition from lack of supplies took a heavy toll on the army, who barely managed to break through to Illyria while suffering many casualties. If anything, it stressed the importance of Philip's assistance in the Antiochene War before the Scipio brothers crossed into Asia. But he did not seem particularly motivated to come to Vulso's aid. He obviously would have been aware of the situation both prior to and during the march back, and rumors suggesting that Philip had willingly allowed the Thracians to strike circulated among Roman leadership, but he was never directly accused. This also coincided with a change in the Amphictyonic League, historically intended to protect the sanctity of Delphi. As the Aetolians held the strongest spot in the league since the invasion of the Gauls a century earlier, a structural reorganization was in order. An inscription suggests that there was a conference in 186, whereby the Romans granted the Delphians an exemption from all forms of taxation, and that the Thessalians were to take a leading role in its management. No mention is made of Philip or the Macedonians, who admittedly had not been official members of the League since the time of Demetrius I. However, his intentional exclusion may be inferred in the reference that the mission, quote, achieved everything that was in the common interest of the Amphictyons and the other Greeks who choose freedom and democracy, end quote. So, with his gains in the war mostly nullified, Philip turned eastwards to the settlements of Maronea and Ainos, Greek cities situated along the coastline of southern Thrace. In 187, he constructed a road to redefine the border of Thrace and strengthen his position, which aroused considerable anger from the Maronites and many of his neighbors, chiefly Eumenes II of Pergamon. Of all allies to gain from the defeat of Antiochus, Eumenes had made out with the largest prize, for the Romans granted him sovereignty over much of Asia Minor east of the Taurus Mountains. Given that Philip had wreaked havoc in his kingdom about a decade earlier, the prospect of an Antigonid encroachment near the Bosphorus was less than appealing. Shortly after the Conference of Delphi, during the winter of 186-185, delegates from Pergamon, Thessaly, Athymania, Maronea, and Macedonia arrived in Rome. The Pergamene ambassadors and their fellows accused Philip of illegally seizing the Thracian settlements as per the Treaty of Apamea, which declared all Greek cities free, whereas the Macedonians countered that the king had done nothing that violated the agreement made with the Romans during the war. Since the Senate would not come to an agreement without Philip's presence, they arranged for a sit-down in Tempe in Thessaly to iron out the situation. At Tempe, the Thessalians and other prosecuting parties questioned Philip's right to hold the cities that he had captured in the war against Antiochus, and attacked his character by suggesting that he would despoil the cities before he gave them up, sabotage their economies, or even arranging for the assassination of envoys. Philip was infuriated, and protested his innocence to the Roman commissioners by accusing the Thessalians of their complicity in the conflict with Aetolia, and stressing his loyalty in the alliance with Rome. In his rage, he growled that such treatment was unjustified, and warned that the sun had not yet set on all his days, a remark which caused the other delegates to rise in uproar at the perceived threat. Yet his cries were for naught, as the commissioners ruled that all Macedonian garrisons were to be withdrawn from Thessaly, and the surrounding regions were to be given up as the borders were limited to the ancestral holdings of the kingdom. Matters involving Macedonia and Aenos were to be held off until the Roman commission made a visit to Thessalonica, yet the tone of the meeting was heavily in favor of freeing them from Macedonian authority entirely. To add insult to injury, Eumenes' envoys suggested that the Attalid ruler be given control of Macedonia instead. Once again, the king pleaded with the commissioners, citing his past support against Antiochus and his compliance with the Roman commanders during the war. Quote, "In view of my support, let me not say my services, for you, which course should you have followed? Should you have done something to increase and extend my kingdom? Or should you have stripped from me what I held either by my own right or through your beneficence, which is exactly what you are doing now? The city-states of the Macedonians, which you admit were part of my realm, are not being restored to me. Eumenes is coming to plunder me as if I were Antiochus, and, for heaven's sake, is using the decree of the 10 commissioners as a cover of his shameless perversion of justice, when it is by this that he can be most effectively refuted and shown to be in the wrong. It is important to know where I stand with you. If you are set on harassing me as a private enemy and as an enemy of your people, carry on with the actions you have begun. But if you have some respect for me as an ally and a king well disposed to you, I beg you not to judge me deserving of such ill treatment." End quote. His defense seems to have inspired sympathy, but the commission deferred a ruling to the authority of the Senate, and in 183 requested that Philip withdraw his soldiers from those settlements, at least for the moment. Unfortunately, Macedonia soon suffered a massacre by Thracian raiders, who broke into the city. Polybius insists that it was an Antigonid scheme to exact revenge upon the Macedonians, but it is more likely that the opportunity to attack a now defenseless site was too good for the Thracians to ignore. The king was still compelled by the Romans to produce officials that were implicated in the supposed plot for interrogation, but one died while en route in Epirus, poisoned according to the historians, leaving the matter unsatisfactory, but the Romans did not pursue it further. During the nearly 2 decades of peace from the end of the Second Macedonian War, changes were taking place in the Antigonid kingdom. Philip turned away from his imperial ambitions to focus more on the restoration of his kingdom's fortunes and the army. Philip's extensive campaigning against both the Romans and in Asia Minor had a heavy toll on the population. Recall that nearly 13,000 Macedonians were killed or captured at the Battle of Cynoscephalae alone, many of whom were veterans that had previously aged out of service or were boys as young as 16. The fact that Philip had to recruit from these groups in the first place emphasizes that he was already working with a limited pool of manpower. Such a defeat also meant that it would take years for the youngest Macedonians to come of age and be recruited into the royal army. Birth rates would have also been hit hard by a declining economic situation brought about by the many years of active warfare, a combination of pillaging by Aetolian and Roman troops, along with an indemnity that would have only added to the burden before the Senate authorized its forgiveness. Philip pushed to reinvigorate the economy and his people by instituting several financial reforms. New mines were opened up across the kingdom, while formerly abandoned sites resumed operations, which provided a steady supply of gold and silver. Such a practice had enabled his namesake Philip II to amass enough wealth to make his state the most powerful in Greece, and the Antigonid ruler was further building on his predecessor's model by minting a large number of gold coins known as the Philippioi. He also introduced new designs on his silver coins. Tetradrachms minted in the latter part of his career show the face of the legendary hero Perseus, with winged cap on the obverse, while the reverse continued to show the club of Heracles, surrounded by an oak wreath that was popularized early in his reign. What significance this meant is unclear exactly, but the quality and quantity of coins produced had increased substantially. Along with gaining access to precious metals, Philip raised revenues by introducing harbor dues and adjusting tax rates for agricultural products, perhaps including timber. The Romans had imposed a limit to the amount of ships the king could have in his navy, but this ended up saving him in the long run, given the cost of building and maintaining the fleets, which would have not been especially useful given his limited range of movement. It also meant that, as one of the few densely wooded areas of the Mediterranean, Macedonian timber could be sold abroad instead of put into domestic shipbuilding. Both the literary and numismatic evidence suggests that Macedonia was prosperous by the end of his reign. The treasury was stockpiled with thousands of gold and silver talents, and had years' worth of grain stored for lean times or during times of war. With the financial situation secure, Philip could now focus on rebuilding the army. Royal decree seems to have stressed that all able-bodied couples were encouraged to have children to combat the demographic decline, the burden of which would have been eased by the improving economy and the limited scale of warfare during this period. Polybius and Livy suggest that he also forcibly transplanted non-Macedonian settlers like Thracians and Celts into the northern and western borders of his kingdom in order to strengthen the defenses in these regions. Unlike the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, there doesn't seem to be any real change in the tactics of the army, nor do the sources suggest any attempts to reform the army wholesale. Nevertheless, an inscription likely dating to just before 197 suggests that there was an attempt to crack down on discipline and ensure greater control over the soldiers' day-to-day behaviors. Evidently, these policies must have worked. By 168, the Macedonian king could field approximately 39,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, a larger force than what Alexander brought with him in his invasion of the Persian Empire. Despite the loss of Macedonia, Philip also worked hard to ensure that the geopolitical situation in Thrace was at least aligned to his interests, if he wasn't able to directly control them. He conducted an expedition in 184 against the Odrysians on behalf of Byzantium, capturing their king Amadocus in the process. Another campaign in the following year forced the Bessi and Dentheletae to submit too. In a series of diplomatic overtures, the king managed to gain the goodwill of the Bastarnae and the Celtic Scordisi near the Danube. He also married off one of his daughters to Terus, king of the Agrianians, in order to secure his support. By the late 180s, the Antigonid kingdom was in remarkably healthy shape, but the story our sources propose leads us to ask, what were Philip's intentions? Polybius and Livy are both very clear on the matter. Philip was secretly planning to renew the war against the Roman hegemony, disgruntled by his mistreatment both during and after the war against Antiochus. Scholars have debated about this endlessly, as Philip would end up never carrying out these plans himself. Building up armed forces may be construed as an aggressive act depending on the context, but Macedonia was an independent state, not beholden to Rome's authority, and it would be suicidal to not have an army of some capacity given the aggressive neighbors surrounding its borders. Due to his earlier ambitions for an Antigonid empire which compelled him to invade Asia Minor in 202, the seizure of Macedonia and the campaigns in Thrace may be a reflection of his past behavior. But this region was historically a problem area for the Antigonid and Argead kings. Such actions may be viewed as defensive in nature, albeit in the confines of interstate violence. If the Romans were concerned about Philip's expansionism, they seem not to have been bothered enough to send any sort of commissioners to investigate or challenge his right to the region outside of the Greek cities. The fact that the Third Macedonian War would be left to his son to carry out leaves the debate to be inconclusive. Regardless, Macedonia was once again the most powerful force in Greece, much of its primacy restored by the king's efforts. While Philip was having great success in these endeavors, events transpiring within the royal household itself would stain the end of his reign with tragedy. As we have stated, Philip had two sons, the eldest named Perseus and the younger named Demetrius. Born in 212, Perseus was 5 years older than Demetrius, but it was rumored that Perseus was actually the son of a concubine, while Demetrius was the product of a legitimate union. There is little to suggest this claim to be true. The two probably were both the children of Philip's wife, Polycratea of Argos, and it is quite evident that Perseus was groomed to be the heir. He had served as a commander leading raids against the Aetolians during the siege of Ambracia in 189, and the introduction of the hero Perseus onto Macedonian coinage was perhaps initiative of Philip to stress the role that Perseus would play as the king-to-be. Polybius paints his early life in a similar vein of his father, a disciplined warrior prince that was moderate in his taste for women and wine, clearly showing potential to be an able king. For all the evidence supporting his position as the heir apparent, the sources suggest that Perseus was deeply insecure about people's opinions regarding his legitimacy and the standing of his brother. After spending 6 years abroad in Rome as a political hostage, Demetrius returned home in 191-190. He had made quite an impression among the Romans during his tenure, including gaining the friendship of Flamininus, the man who had been one of the key figures responsible for managing the affairs of Greece for the past decade. For this reason, he was given the important diplomatic responsibility of defending Philip's actions to the Senate in 184. Rome had received a record number of delegations with complaints against the king, including a visit from Athenias, the brother of Eumenes II, while Demetrius and his fathers Philoi, Apelles, and Philocles were instructed to present the reasons behind the charges. Nervously, he read from a notebook, defending his father's adherence to the agreement laid out with Rome, and the untrustworthiness of his accusers. Apparently, the Senate was pleased at his respectful candor, and due to their fondness for the prince, not their trust of Philip, they considered his word to be truthful. But to appease Eumenes, they would send a commissioner to meet with Philip to formally verify his evacuation of Maronea and Aenus. It was this moment, that Polybius claims, that would sow the seeds of discord from Macedon. In his framework, the Senate's approval of Demetrius had aroused envy in Perseus and mistrust in Philip, and a plot was hatched by an envious Perseus to destroy his brother, and ultimately bring ruin to the dynasty. Polybius's account of the tragedy to befall the Macedonian kingdom has received sharp criticism for its unsatisfactory analysis of these years, and the gaps in his account does not help matters either. Later Roman sources like Livy, Appian, and Plutarch are quick to cast Perseus in the role of villain, while Demetrius was a virtuous, if naive, prince that enjoyed the favor of the Senate. Polybius was a young man during the time of these events, but it is likely that he drew his account from the testimony of one or more Macedonian nobles who had access to the court, probably looking to disassociate themselves with Perseus given the eventual turn of events. Yet he also relied on anti-Macedonian accounts from men he personally disliked. Thus, it will be difficult to untangle this story in a more fair and balanced portrayal, but also to more properly assess what the intentions of Philip and the Roman Republic were. Firstly, the notion that Philip became suspicious of Demetrius due to his success abroad is unfounded. Philip sent his son to Rome on his behalf for a reason, since he had cultivated personal friendships with powerful men like Flamininus, who could potentially be called upon to extricate him from a tense diplomatic situation. It hardly seems reasonable to think that the king would have been annoyed by the fact that his son had achieved exactly what he had hoped for, a Roman response that was more or less dismissive of the charges. It might have incurred jealousy from Perseus, though, who saw that his younger brother's successful negotiations had gained him popularity with the Macedonians for securing peace with Rome. In turn, Demetrius's confidence rose to new levels. Rumors of Perseus's bastard origins made their rounds throughout the kingdom, and factions formed within the court, opportunistically looking to support rival claims to the throne. As per Polybius, both princes were beginning to plot against one another, with spies in each camp reporting the movements of the other, which suggests that Demetrius was not so innocent either. Perseus undermined his father's trust in Demetrius by dropping inflammatory comments whenever the subject of the Romans came up, doing his best to insult them or stir Philip's anger, while Demetrius came to their defense and ultimately did himself no favors. Macedonian politics are notoriously messy. And though the Antigonids held a reputation for familial piety, it would be unsurprising if ambition and or paranoia got the better of both brothers. Perseus's fear of replacement is hinted by an episode where Philip arranged him to marry a princess of the Bastarnae, a match of seemingly low importance which provoked him to launch into a tirade against Demetrius. Modern assessments have also called into question the role of Rome in all of this, suggesting that the Senate's actions expressing favoritism was a deliberate tactic to undermine the unity of the royal house. This is only strengthened by the testimony of Polybius, who reports that a meeting between Demetrius and Flamininus took place shortly after the prince's speech to the Senate, where the elder statesman advised him to take the throne and filled his head with the notions of kingship. It is quite a coincidence that Livy's account just happened to follow the Polybian narrative, except for this one part of the story. Polybius's inclusion and Livy's omission are quite damning, for it would paint the Republic as being far more of an instigator than perhaps they would like to admit. But Flamininus' personal actions don't necessarily constitute the policies of the Roman Senate, though this relationship would be a major point of contention. For what it is worth, the Senate's policies towards the affairs of Greece and Asia had differed little from what they had done decades earlier. Time and time again, we find that embassies being sent complaining of Philip's activities or some other motive, and the Senate would send officials to investigate and deliberate without any real substance. They expressed little in the way of being forceful about any issue, beyond a conciliatory gesture to appease the Greeks, and this includes their dealings with Philip. It is true, the Antigonid king was poorly treated on a number of occasions and came out of the Antiochene War with far less than what he might have hoped for. But this is different than being actively policed by the Republic. He escaped any real consequence following the massacre at Maronea, and though he had been forced to give up his claims over this city, he was allowed to campaign unmolested in the rest of Thrace. Philip was able to build up his forces and restore his economy, without the Senate fathers expressing any sort of concern over his activities. In truth, much of what drove the Romans to act was their relationship with Eumenes, their oldest ally and the vanguard over much of Asia Minor. As we have seen with his wars against Prusias of Bithynia and Mithridates of Pontus, Eumenes was an ambitious ruler who continually leveraged his unique position and relationship with Rome to get what he wanted. When Rome responded favorably towards Philip, they needed to soothe the Pergamene king's fears by sending out commissions to formally demonstrate their goodwill. Yet even when accused of giving support to Prusias in the war against Eumenes, Philip went unpunished. Regardless, the suspicion and mutual distrust simmering under the surface of the Antigonid household came to a boil in a very public way. In the religious festival known as the Xanthica, that took place during the spring of 182, the army was led out in formation to march between the two halves of a sacrificed dog, while the arms and armor of past kings were paraded ahead, a sort of religious purification before the new campaigning season. This also involved a mock battle, a ceremonial event not to be taken too seriously, as they fought with staves rather than spears. Each half of the army was led by one of the princes, but the normally friendly game quickly devolved into a brutal fight, members of each team battling it out as if the throne itself was on the line. Demetrius came out the victor in this scrum, while Perseus retreated to his home to lick his wounds, and ignored his brother's invitations for dinner. Each prince held a feast to cap off the night, and in typical Macedonian fashion, plenty of drinking was involved, leading to loosened lips and clenched fists. Some of Demetrius's companions caught a friend of Perseus spying on their party, and promptly beat him up for his trouble. None of this was known to Demetrius, giddy from the wine and his companions' jokes about Perseus's performance, and elected to visit his brother's house and bring the festivities to him. The accompanying friends were hesitant after their earlier scuffle, and concealed swords in their cloaks in case further violence broke out. A spy within the Demetrian camp raced over to Perseus, and alerted him of the men brandishing weapons, and the prince ordered that his doors be barred to prevent entry, only peeking his head out the window to accuse his brother of attempted murder. The next morning, Perseus brought news of the previous evening's events to his father, who demanded that each of his sons present themselves to explain what happened. In a series of flourishing and emotional speeches, no doubt almost entirely concocted by Livy, Perseus laid out the charges against his brother, claiming he was scheming against his own family while being a lapdog for the Romans, pointing to the rumors of his meetings with Flamininus. Demetrius countered this claim by pointing out that he was a victim of being sent to Italy as a hostage against his will, and stressed his loyalty to his father. Philip was deeply upset by these events, deciding to release both of his sons without punishment. He remained suspicious of Demetrius, though, and decided to send the two Philoi, Philocles and Apelles, back to Rome in early 181 in order to investigate the prince's dealings in the city, not knowing that the loyalty of these men was already purchased by Perseus. Demetrius remained at arm's length from his father, but took care not to communicate with anyone in Rome, lest he draw further negative attention to himself. Such as it was, Philip planned another expedition in Paeonia in 181, designed in mind to keep the army disciplined, but Demetrius was dismissed back to Pella. Accompanying him was Didas, the king's governor over Paeonia, who had become a close confidant of the prince, but secretly was under the employ of Perseus. Under the belief he had a trustworthy friend, Demetrius confessed that he felt increasingly isolated from his father, and was considering an escape through Paeonia to seek asylum from the Romans for his own safety. This was all that was needed, as Didas reported the information to Perseus, who used it to once again denounce his brother to Philip. The king was disturbed by the news, and the return of Philocles and Apelles from Rome produced even more damning information. A letter, supposedly written by Flamininus himself, and stamped with his seal, the contents of which advising the prince to forgo any plans of kingship, and to not harm his family. This letter is extremely controversial. Livy claims it to be an outright forgery, but Philip believed it to be real, and so rendered a final judgment. In early 180, Philip ordered that Demetrius and Didas head to Paeonia. At the city of Heraclea, the prince took part in a banquet, but after imbibing a draught of wine, he almost immediately doubled over and retreated to his bedchambers. His screams about the betrayal of his father and brother echoed throughout the halls as he twisted in agony on his bed, and soon 2 assassins slithered into his room, smothering Demetrius to death. Compared to the dynastic strife that seems to have been rife in the Seleucid and Ptolemaic houses, the Antigonids long held a reputation of strong familial bonds. Virtually no instances of fratricide, parricide, or any similar crimes are to be found in their history. Quite the opposite, in fact. In a famous story recounted by Plutarch, Demetrius Polyarchides was allowed to embrace his father Antigonus with weapons still in hand, to the surprise of all present. Antigonus III Docen acted as a caretaker for the infant Philip when his father Demetrius II had died, choosing instead to forgo having children to protect his nephew's birthright. Now Philip had his own flesh and blood executed, the machinations of his other son eager to secure his place on the throne. This left the king in a terrible state of depression, which turned into rage as he discovered that the letter presented to him was a forgery, the information extracted by the torture of a secretary working for Apelles and Philocles, who were then hunted down and killed. Little could be done, though, as Philip's sole surviving heir was the architect of his other child's murder, a constant living reminder of his mistake. Perseus had purposefully avoided his presence lest his father decided to enact vengeance upon him, though this only aggrieved the Antigonid king further, who now effectively lost 2 sons. This grief was said to consume his body and mind, and by late summer or early autumn of 179, Philip was traveling north into Thrace, but was forced to stop in Amphipolis, where the tormenting guilt of his crimes finally took their toll. Here he became sick, and shortly afterwards succumbed to his illness, where he died at the age of 54. Ruling for 42 years, Philip V had one of, if not the longest reigns in the history of the Macedonian kingdom. In his youth and early maturity, Philip was the quintessential warrior king of his day, but succumbed to his darker vices and paid dearly for them. With his humiliation at the hands of Rome, he regained some of his past virtues as he restored his kingdom to its former prominence, as Polybius puts it, quote, "At the time when King Philip grew great and was powerful in Greece, no one had less regard for good faith and law, but when the wind of his good fortune veered, he was the most moderate of men. When finally he entirely came to grief, he attempted to adapt himself to all contingencies, and by every means to build up his kingdom again." End quote. Yet we see one last final turn of fate as he gives in to his destructive side once again, which leads to the unjust murder of one son and the empowerment of another who was to be the architect of the Antigonid dynasty's downfall. This is if we are to believe the Polybian narrative. As I have made clear, his account of the final days of Philip, the execution of Demetrius, and the machinations of Perseus is fraught with suspicious details. We will never know what truly happened that led to the discord between Perseus and Demetrius, or whether the Romans had anything to do with it. Personally, I believe that Demetrius was far more ambitious than what Polybius or Livy would have us to believe, that the volatile court politics of the Hellenistic period had created such an intense rivalry that it led to a breakdown in their relationship. It is quite possible that he had died of natural causes, and had the blame laid at his father and brother's feet, but the theatrics of his demise renders it messy to take at face value. In his portrayal of Philip V as envisioning the war, but Perseus inheriting it, Polybius may not so subtly be drawing a parallel to Alexander the Great, receiving the responsibility for the invasion of Persia from his father Philip II. Of course, the invasion of Persia catapulted Macedonia to the status of a world empire, whereas the conflict with Rome ended quite differently, but this dramatic contrast seems suspicious. Our assessment of Philip as a ruler need not be overshadowed by the drama of his last days. As a war leader, Philip showed remarkable prowess as a commander starting from a very young age, capable of taking charge in many situations and sometimes in odds that were stacked against him. This can be seen with the Social War and the First Macedonian War, when he fought against the Aetolians and got terms in his favor. Even during the Second Macedonian War, Philip put up a good fight against the Roman Republic, though in the end suffered a humiliating loss. Unlike his contemporary Antiochus III, Philip continued to rule long after his defeat at Rome's hands, and tried to fix the problems that afflicted his kingdom. The economic transformation of Macedonia between 197 and 179 indicates that his policies were able to restore much of its fortunes, and left it with an army of size and strength that had not been seen in many decades. Polybius and Livy acknowledge his successes, though they also undermine them by asserting that he had ignoble intentions of continuing the war against Rome. He was able to navigate his realm through a new political climate, following the intervention of the Roman Republic, not only avoiding the anger of the Senate, but also actually increasing his power as an independent monarch. If Philip had died at Cynoscephalae or just afterwards, we would probably think of him as merely another overly ambitious warlord that was humbled by the rolling tide of Roman conquest. Yet his willingness to spend the second half of his reign largely avoiding conflict and focus on reinvigorating an exhausted Macedonia is worth at least some credit. His actions during the crisis that embroiled his sons may be more questionable due to complications with the sources, but given the Antigonid dynasty's reputation for familial piety, its first appearance during this time may be a hint of some internal turmoil within the household that wasn't managed well enough. Yet with only one legitimate son remaining, the fate of Macedonia would be left in the hands of Perseus, who seemed determined to carry out his father's mission to assert Macedonia's primacy in a world that was increasingly dominated by the Roman Republic. Whether he was capable of doing it is another question entirely.